And it began with a visit to NATO headquarters of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, over the course of which he said that the situation is now more dangerous than it has been. He said this is the most dangerous moment, and he said that on a visit to NATO headquarters, and he said that our intelligence remains grim. Now, that, by the way, that last phrase has been the object of some humour in Britain. Obviously, intelligence is a word with various meanings in the English language. I'm not going to pursue that point further, but The Guardian describes his words as follows. This is Boris Johnson's words. "This is probably the most dangerous moment. I would say that in the course of the next few days, in what is the biggest security crisis that Europe has faced for decades, we've got to get it right." That was Boris Johnson on Thursday, 10th January 2022. And what we learn is that later that evening there was a meeting in the Situation Room in the White House, and apparently that has triggered even further comments about a war scare and talk about an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this was followed up by an extraordinary briefing in the White House by Jake Sullivan, which I'm going to come to shortly, but I would point out that this is a briefing in which Jake Sullivan finally dropped his mask. He was no longer the senior administration official. He became finally Jake Sullivan, and of course the most eye-catching part of it was that he said that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could happen any day. It could happen before the end of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. And he said that it was crystal clear that all Americans in Ukraine had to leave. And on the following day, Saturday, we've heard further reports that the United States is drawing down the staff at its embassy in Kiev. Apparently the British are doing the same. There's even some reports that the entire embassy, what's left of it after most of the staff, the US staff, are recalled to Washington, that what's left of the embassy is going to be relocated to the West Ukrainian city of Lvov. I will come back again later in the program to the implications of all of this. And of course, we've also had further reports over the course of today that the British and presumably the Americans are pulling out all their staff, all their personnel from Ukraine. Note that this apparently includes military personnel who have been training the Ukrainian military. The British are pulling out all their people by Monday. This is the big training mission that was sent there a few days ago to tell Ukrainian troops how to use these light anti-tank weapons that Britain has supplied. Well, that didn't last very long. The entire military mission, not just the people who were sent by Britain to train them to use these light anti-tank weapons, but as it turns out, all the British military staff, including those who've been there for a long time, they're being pulled out too. And I assume the same applies to the staff that the United States, the military personnel that the United States has had in Ukraine on training missions, and I presume Canada and all the other countries that have been providing training missions, they're going to pull out their personnel as well. And in fact, we've had a whole succession of statements from the United States, including from President Biden himself, in which he's made it absolutely clear that military troops, US troops, will not be deployed to Ukraine, that there is no possibility of the United States engaging Russian troops in a battle for Ukraine, and even those troops that are now being redeployed to Europe by the United States, a couple of thousand in total, they will not be entering Ukraine under any circumstances, not even to evacuate US citizens in the event that there is in fact fighting or an invasion or a war there. So that's what the United States and Britain have been saying, and it also was what the United States communicated in a briefing with NATO leaders that was carried out by President Biden, apparently on Friday, early on Friday, or perhaps late on Thursday, 10th or 11th February, and it's also the pattern of all the media commentary, of course, which we've been seeing. In fact, the media commentary has gone a great deal further. It's suggested that orders that the United States and Britain have obtained details of the orders that the Russian military have received from President Putin about the attack on Ukraine. That, by the way, has been denied by the United States, by Jake Sullivan over that course of that press conference on Friday, and there's also been all sorts of other claims, including claims that the Russian invasion, or at least the first steps for that Russian invasion, are going to happen on Tuesday or Wednesday. I'm going to say in advance that whilst some of this reporting may accurately reflect leaks that US officials are planting in the media, I suspect that what's also happening is that a lot of reporters in Washington are calling their sources in the various in the US government, in the intelligence agencies, in the State Department, and are trying to get their sources to provide them with information about a situation about which, as will become clear in a moment, the United States is actually extremely ill-informed, and the result is that as a result of these rather fevered conversations that are going on, all sorts of wild stories are appearing as the sources peppered across this gigantic US bureaucracy try to give the reporters the kind of red meat information that the reporters are looking for. Anyway, all of that is going on, and of course it's now been picked up by the Russians themselves, and the Russians have also said that they're going to pull out some of their staff, their embassy staff, from Kiev and from their various consulates up and down Ukraine. The Russian Foreign Ministry has made it very clear that the embassy and the consulates will continue to operate. So it's not the complete pull-out of embassy staff, or at least it doesn't look like the kind of complete pull-out of embassy staff, leaving just a skeleton crew behind that the Western governments are conducting. And I should say that not all Western governments seem to be following this line. Apparently Germany intends to continue to maintain its embassy in Kiev, at least at the moment, and I gather France as well, and the EU has ruled out pulling out all its staff from Ukraine too. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is a general summary of the situation. So what is happening? Why is this sudden war scare? Why do we have from Thursday 10th February, all this fevered talk of a Russian invasion, of a Russian attack on Ukraine next week? Why is Boris Johnson saying that we're in the most dangerous, critical moment? Why is Jake Sullivan saying exactly the same thing? Well, let's first of all turn to Jake Sullivan's briefing to the media. As I said, there's been all kinds of off-the-record briefings, but I'm just not going to spend any time analysing those, because I don't know how well informed the people who are providing these briefings really are. And as I said, the dynamic of these off-the-record comments may be more complicated than appears. It could be, as I said, a case of reporters pressing their sources for information, and the sources within the US government coming up with comments which might not be entirely true, but which are intended to maintain or preserve the relationship with the journalists. So I'm going to disregard that, and I'm going to go directly to what Jake Sullivan said. And I'm going to say straight away that if one does, and one reads his comments carefully, it becomes immediately apparent what is behind this particular war scare, or at least what is the information that the United States and Britain are circulating, which is being used to justify this war scare. I say that because, though I'm not going to go through every part of Jake Sullivan's briefing, in fact, I'm not going to discuss it in immense detail either, because to do so would take an inordinate amount of time. It's absolutely clear that Jake Sullivan, the United States government, doesn't know what Russian intentions are. Sullivan makes that point repeatedly over the course of the briefing. He says he doesn't know whether any decision has been made by President Putin to initiate an invasion. I would say that it's always the case with all Western commentary that every Russian decision is attributed to Putin exclusively. If any decision to start a war in Ukraine was made, lots of policymakers in Moscow would be involved, not just Putin himself. But anyway, Jake Sullivan and the press corps all talk about Putin. They clearly don't know what intentions Putin or Russia has. They've got no intelligence about the Russians intending to start a war in Ukraine. And it also turns out that they are profoundly ill-informed about Russian military plans, assuming that there was an invasion. Again, when Jake Sullivan was asked about that, he essentially admitted that the United States doesn't have any information about this, though again, he floated the possibility of a Russian attack on Kiev itself, a Russian advance on Kiev, and an attempt to seize Kiev and install some kind of government there and achieve regime change there. But again, it's clear that this is not based on any actual precise intelligence, any intelligence information about the nature of Russian war plans. The United States has not seen or obtained any Russian war plans. It is inferring possible Russian actions from events on the ground. And it's those events on the ground that I'm now going to turn to. And this is the point at which I'm going to quote Jake Sullivan and what Jake Sullivan said. And it provides us the key to understanding what's been happening since the 10th of January. Why on the 10th of January all these alarm bells started to ring in London, with Boris Johnson's comments, in NATO headquarters and in Washington. What it was that the president and the other officials in the administration, including, of course, Jake Sullivan, were briefed about in the White House on Thursday, 10th February, when all this, as I said, this latest war scare was specifically initiated. And these were Jake Sullivan's words. I'm not going to get into intelligence information, but if you look at the disposition of forces, in both Belarus and in Russia, on the other side of the Ukrainian borders, from the north, from the east, the Russians are in a position to be able to mount a major military action in Ukraine any day now. And for that reason, we believe that it is important for us to communicate to our allies and partners, to the Ukrainians and to the American citizens who are still there. Now, actually, that is very clear, and it gives the game away. I think it's clearer, perhaps, than Sullivan intended it to be. The United States doesn't have any information about Russian intentions. It doesn't have any information about Russian war plans. Its information is the disposition of Russian forces in both Belarus and in Russia, the fact that the Russians now have troops on the north and east of the Ukrainian border, that the Russians are in a position to be able to mount a military action in Ukraine. And he says clearly that we believe that it is, and for that reason, because the Russians have all these forces in place, we believe that it is important for us to communicate to our allies and partners, to the Ukrainians, and to the American citizens who are still there. In other words, the intelligence is the disposition of Russian forces. Russian forces in European Russia, in Voronezh and Rostov regions, and in places east of Ukraine, and also the presence of Russian forces in Belarus. And that is, in fact, it's the last point that is the key. Because on the 10th of February, the very day when all of this began, when we've seen all this, Boris Johnson coming along to NATO headquarters talking about intelligence being grim, on the very same day, apparently, that there was this briefing in the White House Situation Room, on that day, a Russian military exercise alongside the Belarusian army in Belarus began, the 10th of February 2022. And one doesn't actually need a huge amount of intelligence, secret, classified intelligence, to have any real to work out much about it, because the Russian Defense Ministry has actually provided quite a lot of information. And you will find the following link from the Russian Defense Ministry under this video. And it reads, Union Courage 2022. And it goes on to say, from February 10th to 20th, notice these dates, the Russian-Belarusian Joint Operational Exercise Union Courage 2022 is being held on the territory of the Republic of Belarus as part of the inspection of the reaction forces of the Union State. The Union State is this association between Belarus and Russia, which has been given renewed impetus since Lukashenko saw off the colour revolution attempt, which was launched against him in 2020. And then the bulletin, the piece from the Russian Defense Ministry goes on to say, the purpose of the exercise is to work out tasks for suppressing and repelling external aggression during a defensive operation, countering terrorism and protecting the interests of the Union State. During the exercises, measures have been taken to strengthen the protection of the state border, to protect the infiltration of to prevent the infiltration of armed groups of militants, to block the channels of delivery of weapons and ammunition, to search, block, destroy illegal armed formations and diversionary reconnaissance groups of a mock enemy. The practical actions of the troops takes place at the Domanovsky, Gorsky, Obuzlesnovsky, Brestsky, Osipovichi training grounds and in certain areas of the territory of the Republic of Belarus. The airfields of Baranovichy, Luninets, Lida and Marchulishchi are also involved. And by the way, I should say that alongside this information, this written information, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided a map of where all these exercises are taking place. And I will say in advance that they're taking place all over Belarus, in various training areas all over Belarus. And then it goes on to say that the exercise involved command bodies, military units and formations of the Eastern Military District and the armed forces of the Republic of Belarus. Now, the Eastern Military District relates to forces in Eastern Russia, places like Vladivostok, Kamchatka and all the rest. Troops have been transferred from there to Belarus to engage in these exercises. It includes Sukhoi 35 fighter jets, surface-to-air missiles, including S-400 missiles, and the Russians have provided extensive coverage, video coverage of these exercises. And then the Ministry of Defense information finishes the number of participants in the event, as well as the number of main weapon systems subject to the Vienna document of 2011 do not exceed the parameters defined by it, which are subject to notification. Now, that would suggest that the total number of troops, Russian and Belarusian troops, participating in this exercise is under 9,000. The Western powers, the United States and Britain, put the number much higher than that. They suggest that it is as high as 30,000. Well, it's difficult to say, but as I said, the Russians are giving us some ideas of the number of troops involved, and they put it at the upper limit that is required below the upper limit, the lower limit, which requires notification under the 2011 Vienna document, and that limit is 9,000. So it must be, if the Russians are correct, fewer troops than that. 9,000 must be the absolute total, the uppermost total of the number of troops involved. So it's this that is causing all the tension. The fact that there are these military exercises of Russian and Belarusian troops going on in Belarus. That's what Jake Sullivan said, coming back to the briefing. If you look at the disposition of forces in both Belarus and in Russia, the Russians are in a position to mount a major military action in Ukraine any day now. So it is the fact that these exercises in Belarus are taking place which is the cause of this war scare. And I would add, and perhaps not by chance, the exercises in Belarus are also taking place in parallel with Russian naval exercises in the Black Sea. These naval exercises, by the way, have been prepared and highlighted over quite a lengthy period, and they're part of global exercises that the Russian Navy has been engaged in since 2020. Since the start of 2022, all Russian fleets are engaging in major naval exercises. At the moment, there was an exercise, by the way, west of the Irish coast, which caused some concerns in Ireland. The Russians moved it further west after complaints from the Irish about it. These are major naval exercises taking place involving all Russian fleets around the world. And those are the first such exercises, by the way, that the Russian Navy has engaged in since the fall of the Soviet Union. And they've been planned over quite a lengthy period, and they are undoubtedly intended, or were intended, as part of the underlying process of reviving and reconstructing the Russian Navy, which, by the way, was particularly badly hit during the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed. So this is what is triggered this particular war scare. It is the start of those military exercises, especially the ones in Belarus. And note again the dates which the Russians have given us. The dates of these exercises extend from the 10th of February to the 20th of February. Now, on the 20th of February, the Winter Olympics end, so it's entirely understandable why Jake Sullivan, over the course of that press briefing, said that the Russian attack on Ukraine might be launched before the end of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, because the deadline for the ending of these exercises is said to be 20th February. So if the Russians are indeed going to use these exercises as a springboard to strike Ukraine, at Ukraine from the north, then logically this must happen before the exercises are scheduled to end, which, as I said, is the 20th of February, which is, of course, the day when the Olympics end. So all the pieces fit into place. What is causing this alarm is the fact that these exercises are going on in Belarus. And can I just say, first of all, that some of this alarm is warranted. One of the things that has happened, and which these exercises have perhaps rammed home, is how militarily unsustainable Ukraine's position has now become. As the Ukrainians themselves have been complaining over the last few days, they are now in effect surrounded by hostile forces. There's a large Russian military concentration in Crimea, which has been incrementally building up over the last couple of years. And there's, of course, a very powerful Russian army military presence in Western Russia, east of Ukraine's border. Then there's the various militias in the Donbass, said to number around 35,000 men, and heavily equipped apparently with some armoured, with quite a lot of armour, more apparently proportionately to their size than the Ukrainian military is. Ukrainian military has more armour overall, but apparently the militia has a higher density of armour than the Ukrainian military does. And of course, there's now the potential of a strike on Ukraine from the north, from Belarus. And at this point, perhaps it's worth adding something further, which is that all this talk about Kiev suddenly being in danger makes a lot more sense if you imagine or expect a strike from the north, from Belarus, for two reasons. Firstly, Kiev is closer to the Belarusian border. The Russians would have to drive quite a long way to get to Kiev if they were advancing either from Crimea or from the east, from Ukraine's eastern border via the Donbass. And of course, most of the Ukrainian army is now based around on the conflict line facing off Donbass. So it's the proximity is closer if you are looking at a Russian advance from the north via Belarus. And apparently, and here again, I'm not an expert on these things, but apparently there is another factor, which is that apparently there's been a great deal of reliance on the part of the Western militaries and the Ukrainian military on using the Dnieper River, upon which, by the way, Kiev is located, as a sort of last line of defense. The Russians would have to cross the Dnieper River to actually capture Kiev itself. It would need a riverine landing. But of course, the Russians, the Dnieper River flows through Belarus. So by positioning troops in Belarus, the Russians can cross the Dnieper River on friendly territory in Belarus itself, and could march on Kiev from the north and west of the Dnieper River, investing Kiev and surrounding it and capturing it in that kind of way. So it's possible to put all the pieces together and to understand the hysteria if you really believe, or if you want people to believe, that there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine pending. But coming back to what Jake Sullivan was saying, having all these troops in all of these places doesn't, of course, mean that the Russians are indeed planning an advance on Kiev from Belarus, or are preparing to launch a strike on on Kiev from Belarus. It doesn't prove that there's any kind of invasion or attack pending. And of course, the Russians continue to deny that they have any such plan. And they denied it in a fraught conversation that has taken place earlier today between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and US Secretary of State Tony Blinken. And the Russians have provided a media release, and it reads as follows. On February 12th, at the American initiative, a telephone conversation took place between the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The minister stressed that the propaganda campaign launched by the United States and its allies about Russian aggression, words put in quotation marks, against Ukraine pursues provocative goals, encouraging the authorities in Kiev to sabotage the Minsk agreements and creates harmful conditions to resolve this, for Kiev to resolve the Donbass problem by force. As the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry noted, the reaction of Washington and Brussels to the drafts of the Russian-American Treaty and agreement with NATO on security guarantees submitted by us ignores key provisions for us, primarily on the non-expansion of the alliance and the non-deployment of strike weapons near Russian borders. It was emphasized that these issues will be at the center of our assessment of these documents received from the United States and NATO, which will be brought to the attention of colleagues. Sergei Lavrov recalled the inadmissibility of actions that violate commitments made at the highest level on the indivisibility of security in the Euro-Atlantic region. The heads of the foreign ministries also touched upon some topical issues of bilateral relations. The last, by the way, almost certainly relates to this extremely fraught issue of Russian and American diplomatic representation in their respective countries. I'm not going to discuss that today. So we see that Lavrov says that there's been a propaganda campaign launched by the United States and its allies about Russian aggression, that it pursues provocative goals, and that it encourages Ukraine to sabotage the Minsk agreements, and this is harmful to attempts to resolve the Donbass problem and leaves open the possibility that Ukraine might be intending to do it by force. And the last point is perhaps important, because the Russians are saying that all of this media activity, all these statements about a possible war next week might suggest that something is being cooked up in Ukraine itself, and for that reason, that's the reason they're giving for reducing the staff of their embassy in Kiev and their consulates in Ukraine. So, but the essential point is that the Russians again are denying, or at least Lavrov denied to Blinken, that there is a Russian attack against Ukraine being prepared. And the same denial was given on 11th February 2022 in a meeting in Moscow between the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and the British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace. Shoigu again said to Wallace that Russia is not planning to attack Ukraine. And of course, it was also what was said on the previous day, 10th February 2022, by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in that fraught conversation he had with Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary. So all of this shows that the Russians continue to deny all of this. And it's important to say that the Russians are still looking to receive Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, in Moscow on Tuesday. And it seems that Scholz, for his part, still intends to travel to Kiev on Monday to meet with Zelensky there. And he still intends to go to Moscow on Tuesday to speak with Putin and to have a face-to-face meeting with Putin. So that seems inconsistent with either the Russians or the Germans anticipating some kind of war in Ukraine. It certainly seems inconsistent to me with a Russian plan to attack Ukraine. And going back to that earlier video in which I discussed the way in which the Americans seem to be putting enormous pressure on the Germans to announce the cancellation of Nord Stream 2, or at least to publicly commit to cancelling Nord Stream 2 as part of any sanctions package in the event of a war in Ukraine. It could be that a lot of this hysteria about war that we are seeing is partly intended, or at least perhaps even mainly intended, to get Scholz to call off his visit to Russia on Tuesday. Note again that Bloomberg in particular was claiming that the attack on Ukraine, the Russian attack on Ukraine, was due to take place on Tuesday, the very day when Scholz is supposed to be going to Moscow. So it could very well be that this is partly the agenda. It's partly intended to dissuade Scholz from travelling to Moscow, to Kiev and Moscow. And that might be part of the agenda, though if so, I have to say it hasn't happened yet. It seems that Scholz is still intending to go. And in the meantime, we also have comments from President Zelensky, and he apparently is again playing down the danger of war. And I take this from the live feed in the Daily Telegraph. This might not be easy to find, but what the Daily Telegraph, Natalia Vasilyeva, Daily Telegraph correspondent in Kiev, is reporting Zelensky is saying. It says Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, has said he did not have 100% certain reports pointing to an imminent Russian attack. Asked if he agreed with the US assessment of the imminent Russian invasion, President Zelensky said on Saturday that Kiev has to study all the information we receive very carefully and be ready for all possible risks. Speaking about the media reports that Russia might launch an attack on Ukraine on Wednesday, February 16th, Zelensky sought to play it down, telling a reporter, if you have additional 100% certain information about a Russian invasion of Ukraine, please share it with us. We are aware of all risks and we realize the risks are there. He refused to say if he agreed or disagreed with the US assessment about the distinct possibility of a Russian invasion, as Ukraine has been suffering from Russian aggression in different forms since 2015. I cannot agree or disagree with what hasn't happened yet. Right now, there is no full-scale war in Ukraine. He urged the media not to spread the war scare. Panic is the best friend of our enemy. And here I'm going to make my next point. I don't know what's going to happen next week. I very much doubt, I still very much doubt that there is any Russian plan to attack Ukraine Well, I should correct that. I say that I don't very much doubt that there is any Russian intention to launch an attack on Ukraine. I doubt that the number of troops in Belarus come anywhere close to this figure of 30,000 that it's been talked about. 9,000, probably fewer, seems to be the total number of troops from both Belarus and Russia that are engaged in these exercises in Belarus. And I don't believe that that's anywhere near enough a force to advance on Kiev and to capture it. And I don't think that's the Russian plan. However, as the Russians have said, it's possible that something is being cooked up. It could be that something might happen next week before the Olympics end, before this exercise ends. Who knows? But regardless, it must be the case that the Ukrainians themselves are feeling massively let down at the moment. Because consider what's happened. We have all this talk about war between Russia and Ukraine. We have all this talk about an attack on Ukraine by Russia. And what are the Western powers doing? They're evacuating their embassy staffs from Kiev. They're telling all their people in Ukraine to leave. They're pulling out all the troops they have in Ukraine. They're saying that under no circumstances will they come to Ukraine's defense. They're saying that under no circumstances will their troops cross into Ukraine if there is a war with Russia. They've even said that their troops will not enter Ukraine in order to evacuate their own citizens from Ukraine in the event of a war. All those troops, as I said, who were sent to Ukraine, not large numbers, but some of them, to carry out all those exercises, to train the Ukrainian troops, they're all being pulled out before their training missions have ended, or in the case of the British troops sent to train the Ukrainians in those use of those light anti-tank weapons, before that training has even properly started. So the Ukrainians must feel that all this talk of support for Ukraine ultimately doesn't amount to very much. And it must be particularly bitter that apparently Blinken telephoned the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba on Friday 11th February, and again assured Ukraine of the US's support, and apparently some kind of letter of support has been sent from the United States to Ukraine. But it's clear that all these statements of support from Ukraine are verbal only. The only thing that the United States is able to do, or is saying it's going to do, is going to impose sanctions on Russia, which of course in a war situation between Russia and Ukraine isn't going to help Ukraine at all. So all this talk about Western support amounts to very little so far as Ukraine itself is concerned. And I come back to that point I have made many times. If the United States is not prepared to fight to defend Ukraine, if NATO is not prepared to fight to defend Ukraine, if, as Biden says, it is inconceivable that US troops could go and fight the Russians in Ukraine because that would start World War III, then why are we still talking about the possibility of Ukraine entering NATO one day? Why are we sticking by this issue of the open door, NATO's fictional open door, which has no actual foundation in the actual language of Article 10 of the 1949 Washington Treaty? Why do we continue to hear all of this? Why are we risking Ukraine's existence on the principle, in defense of a principle which does not exist, it's not found in the treaty, and which means nothing in practice. Well, on that point, I'm going to end. I think the best thing to do now is to wait and see what the diplomacy produces. Biden is going to speak to Putin later today, Saturday. Apparently, in a state of great agitation, the Americans tried to contact the Russians yesterday to set up this telephone meeting between Biden and Putin. The Russians weren't too keen. Apparently, the US sent a letter, a written request for this meeting, followed up with verbal requests. They're really badgering the Russians for this telephone conversation. Putin had earlier agreed to speak to Macron. This is apparently part of the long-standing discussions between the Russians and the French, of which Macron's visit to Moscow a few days ago was part. So this is already a scheduled meeting. Putin, the Russians weren't particularly keen on another call between Putin and a Western leader on Saturday. They suggested Monday instead, but the Americans, as I said, badgered them, and eventually the Russians agreed. So we'll see what comes of that discussion between Putin and Biden today. And we will see what comes of that further discussion between Putin and Macron today. We will see what the two leaders exchange with each other. So let's wait for the readouts. Let's see what the various parties to all of these talks say. So I'm going to wait until we have a clearer picture of what the diplomatic situation is, what the discussions between the various leaders are going to tell us about the way the situation is going forward. Well, I'm going to finish with one very final point, and it was a very interesting one, and it also slipped out during this briefing that Jake Sullivan gave in the White House. And he was asked questions about the Chinese-Russian joint statement and about the fact that the Chinese are clearly supporting the Russians in this matter. And he said that if the Chinese are taking that step, it's not going to be a good one for China. And of course, Chinese support for Russia is not going to help the Russians very much either. But he made one particular point which really stood out for me. He talked about the long-term competition between the Western powers and the Eurasian bloc. And he said that the Western powers, the collective West, the United States and its various allies, its NATO allies, and presumably South Korea and Japan, in aggregate, command 50% of the world's GDP, which is more than the Chinese and the Russians in aggregate do. He put that at just 20%, a figure, by the way, which I suspect is wrong. But anyway, never mind. I found that a very interesting comment because, in effect, it does already amount to a switch of position. Once upon a time, a US official commenting about the United States' leading adversaries would have pointed out that it is the US whose GDP surpasses the level of those adversaries. This time, Sullivan couldn't say that. He had to say instead that it was the collective West's GDP which surpasses that of the US's adversaries. Now, that already suggests that the US senses that the aggregate economic, industrial, technological, and scientific power of the Chinese and the Russians exceeds that of the United States itself. The United States has to look to its allies to make the difference, to maintain this notional economic advantage. That is an interesting fact in itself, and it shows that the United States is finding itself increasingly in a position of disadvantage with respect to its adversaries, and one where it has to look to its allies to make up the difference. But of course that again begs the question of whether those allies really do make up the difference in any real sense. And of course, as is well known, the Europeans, the Japanese, and all the rest, in military terms, are simply not an equivalent force to the Eurasians or indeed the Americans, and it's most unlikely, regardless of what happens in Ukraine over the next few days, that that's going to change. I merely point this out. This is the first time, as I said, that I've seen an implicit admission from a senior American official that the aggregate resources of America's enemies exceed America's own, so that the United States has to rely on its allies to keep itself ahead. Well, on that somewhat, shall we say, philosophical note, I'm going to end this program. We'll see, as I said, what comes of all these discussions between Biden and Putin and Biden and Macron over the course of today, Saturday. Macron and Putin are going to speak first. Biden and Putin are going to speak later. Macron's call with Putin, as I said, was already scheduled. Biden's call with Putin has had to be hurriedly agreed, and we'll see what comes of it. And we will also see whether or not Olaf Scholz does indeed persist with his trips to Kiev and Moscow next week, or whether he will succumb to the, I suspect, very intense pressure that he's coming under behind the scenes to get him to call this visit off. Anyway, we will see what happens and how events play out, but certainly it's been a wild couple of hours, and we must look forward to a wild couple of days. Thank you very much for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. You'll find links under this video, and of course you'll also find links to Alex's channel. And of course, please remember to look us up on Rumble and Locals, as I discussed at the start of this video.